Have you ever stopped to think about what actually happened to those German machine gun crews who spent hours cutting down wave after wave of Allied soldiers on those exposed beaches in Normandy? Not the sanitized version you get in most history books, but the real story of what became of these men once the tide of battle finally turned against them? What we're about to explore goes beyond the typical recounting of the largest amphibious invasion ever mounted, diving instead into the lesser-known human moments that defined June 6, 1944, for the men on both sides of those murderous gun sites. To understand what happened to these crews, we need to step back and look at the weapon itself and how it came to dominate German defensive thinking. The MG42 machine gun arrived on the battlefield in 1942, and within months it had earned a reputation that would follow it through every campaign for the rest of the war. This wasn't just another infantry weapon. It was a game-changer that fundamentally altered how the German army thought about defense, from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front, from the mountains of Italy to the fortified positions along the Atlantic coastline. This weapon went everywhere German troops went. Soldiers on the receiving end had their own names for it. Some called it the bone saw. Others knew it as the Ripper. But the most common nickname, the one that stuck, was the one coined by Allied troops who heard that distinctive tearing sound as rounds ripped through the air at nearly 1,300 rounds per minute. They called it the buzzsaw, and that terrifying high-pitched ripping noise became the soundtrack to countless nightmares for men who survived its fire. But this isn't a story about technical specifications or catchy nicknames. This is about the human beings who operated those weapons during the most critical hours of the Second World War, and about the various fates that awaited them once the carefully prepared German defensive scheme began to collapse under the weight of the Allied onslaught. The top leadership in Berlin had based their entire coastal defense strategy on a single premise. Any invasion attempt had to be destroyed while the attackers were still in the water, before they could establish even the smallest foothold on French soil. To make this vision a reality, German engineers and forced labour crews spent years constructing an elaborate network of fortifications along thousands of miles of coastline. These weren't simple trenches or foxholes. They were sophisticated defensive positions, carefully designed strong points that the Germans called Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, each one positioned to create interlocking fields of fire with its neighbours. The concept was brutally simple and terrifyingly effective when properly executed. Artillery pieces and machine guns were sighted so their firing arcs overlapped, creating a web of death that covered every inch of beach. Anyone lucky enough to slip past one gun position would immediately come under fire from another. There was supposed to be no safe ground, no dead zones where attacking troops could gather and organize. On Omaha Beach alone, American intelligence had identified roughly 15 of these major strongpoints, each one a miniature fortress bristling with weapons. Many were specifically oriented to fire lengthwise down the beach, a tactic called enfilade fire that allowed gunners to rake entire sections of shoreline with sustained bursts. A soldier caught in enfilade fire had nowhere to hide. The bullets came from the side, and the only cover was behind you, back in the water you had just left. Inside these positions, a typical MG42 emplacement required a crew of 3 men to operate at peak efficiency. The gunner himself sat behind the weapon, his hands on the grips, his eyes searching for targets, his finger on the trigger. Beside him sat the assistant gunner, a role that was far more demanding than the title suggested. This man fed the ammunition belts into the weapon, a task that required constant attention because the MG42 consumed ammunition at a ferocious rate. He also carried spare barrels, an absolute necessity because the incredible rate of fire caused barrels to overheat within minutes of sustained firing. When the metal started glowing red, the assistant had to perform a quick barrel change while under fire, a procedure that took nerve and practice. The third member of the team served as the ammunition bearer, hauling the heavy metal cans of linked ammunition that kept the gun fed. In a prolonged firefight, this man might make multiple trips back to supply points, bent double under the weight of the ammunition, always aware that a single lucky shot could detonate everything he was carrying. By the spring of 1944, these crews represented a mix of experience levels that reflected the changing fortunes of the German military. Some were hardened veterans who had survived campaigns in Russia or the Mediterranean, men who had been firing machine guns in combat for years and knew every trick of the trade. They understood how to read terrain, how to spot the telltale signs of an approaching infantry assault, how to conserve ammunition during lulls and pour it out when it mattered most. But many others were young replacements, teenagers in some cases, who had been rushed through training and sent west to fill the gaps in coastal divisions that had been stripped of their best troops for service on other fronts. Some of these youngsters had never heard a shot fired in anger. They knew their weapons from training exercises, but they had no concept of what it felt like to have enemy fire coming back at you, no experience with the fog of combat or the paralysis that fear can bring. Regardless of their backgrounds or experience, every man in every gun crew along the Atlantic coast had received the same basic orders. When the invasion came, they were to keep their fingers on the triggers until one of two things happened. Either the beach in front of them was empty of living enemies, or they themselves were dead at their posts. It was a simple instruction, easy to understand, difficult to execute, and impossible to survive if things went wrong. What most of these men did not fully grasp, because they lacked the broader strategic picture, was that the very weapon that made them such a feared part of the German defensive system would also make them the highest priority targets for every Allied soldier who made it off the landing craft alive. The MG42's effectiveness made it essential to German defence, but it also painted an invisible target on the head of every man who operated one. Allied intelligence officers and invasion planners knew all about those guns. They had spent months studying aerial photographs, examining reconnaissance reports, interviewing French resistance fighters who watched the Germans build their defences. They numbered the strong points, sketched their fields of fire, estimated the number of weapons in each position. On paper, the plan to neutralise these defences looked elegant and achievable. Heavy bombers would strike the coastal fortifications before dawn, pulverising the concrete bunkers and destroying gun positions. Naval vessels, everything from massive battleships to smaller destroyers, would then close with the shore and hammer any surviving positions with thousands of shells. By the time the landing craft reached the beach, the theory went, most of the German defenders would be dead, wounded, or too stunned to offer effective resistance. Infantry would mop up whatever remained and push inland before the Germans could organise a counterattack. It was a good plan, a reasonable plan based on sound military principles and massive firepower superiority. Reality, as soldiers on both sides would discover, rarely cooperates with even the best laid plans. When dawn broke on the 6th of June and the landing ramps finally crashed down onto the sand and surf, a horrifying number of those German machine guns were still operational, still manned, and still firing. The elaborate bombardment that was supposed to eliminate them had failed in its primary objective. The naval barrage that preceded the landings had been genuinely awesome in scale. Battleships with guns that fired shells the size of small cars, cruisers that could reduce a building to rubble with a single salvo, destroyers that pumped out hundreds of shells in rapid succession. All of these vessels had opened fire in the pre-dawn darkness and pounded the French coastline with a weight of explosives that seemed certain to obliterate anything in its path. The noise alone was beyond description, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the earth and turned the sky orange with muzzle flashes and explosions. Thousands upon thousands of shells screamed overhead and slammed into the bluffs and beaches where the German defences waited. Yet when the smoke began to clear and the first landing craft approached the shore, the terrible truth became apparent. Reinforced concrete, when properly designed and constructed, can absorb incredible punishment. Direct hits from heavy naval guns would crack the exterior, send chunks of concrete flying, fill the interior with dust and noise, but the structures held. Gun positions that had been hit multiple times remained functional. The men inside might be deafened, might be bleeding from their noses and ears from the concussive effects of near misses, but they were alive and their weapons still worked. Numerous strong points that had been marked for destruction in the pre-assault planning emerged from the bombardment essentially intact. The Germans inside these positions had endured hours of the most intense artillery fire most of them would ever experience. They knew something enormous was happening. When they finally dared to peek out through firing ports or observation slits, they saw a sight that many later described as unreal or impossible. The horizon, as far as the eye could see in either direction, was crowded with ships, thousands of vessels of every description, from massive warships to tiny landing craft, all heading directly toward them. The beaches where British and Canadian forces landed had an advantage that Omaha Beach lacked. Specialized armored vehicles, nicknamed funnies by the troops who operated them, provided crucial support in neutralizing stubborn German positions. These strange-looking machines included tanks that could launch massive explosive charges against fortified bunkers, armored vehicles that laid down carpet-like mats to help other vehicles cross soft sand, and flail tanks that detonated mines with rotating chains. On Omaha, the American plan had called for similar armor support in the form of duplex-drive amphibious tanks, regular Sherman tanks fitted with flotation screens that would allow them to swim ashore under their own power. The idea was sound, but the execution turned into a disaster that would cost lives all day long. Of the 32 swimming tanks launched in the first wave approaching Omaha, 27 sank in the choppy seas, taking their crews down with them. 5 tanks actually reached the beach, but only 3 could fight, and those were quickly knocked out by German anti-tank guns and artillery. The job of silencing the surviving MG42 positions, the task that was supposed to be supported by armor, instead fell entirely on the shoulders of infantrymen armed with nothing heavier than rifles and grenades. What followed was a slaughter that exceeded the worst fears of even the most pessimistic Allied planners. The Germans who manned those machine guns amplified the already devastating lethality of the MG42 with tactics they had refined through years of combat experience. One particularly effective method that gunners used was called mowing the grass, a technique that sounds almost pastoral until you understand what it meant in practice. Instead of aiming at chest height, where soldiers might be protected by terrain or obstacles, gunners deliberately aimed low, sweeping the gun back and forth just inches above the sand and water. The goal was to shatter legs and drop men into the surf, where they would drown if their wounds didn't kill them first. The screams of the wounded drew medics and would-be rescuers, who then became additional targets. Another tactic paired deception with precision in a way that caught many attackers completely by surprise. One gun position would open fire with tracers, those special rounds that burn brightly so gunners can see where their bullets are going. But the tracers would be deliberately aimed high, over the heads of the advancing troops, suggesting that the gunner was panicking or had misjudged the range. Soldiers who saw those tracers passing overhead would often stand up or advance more boldly, believing the fire was inaccurate. They had no way of knowing that a second gun, carefully concealed and firing without tracers, was aimed at exactly the right height and was doing the actual killing. Simple tactics, brutal in their effectiveness, and perfectly designed to catch inexperienced troops off guard. As the first waves of American infantry hit the sand at Omaha, the tidy plans that had been drawn up in England disintegrated within minutes. Casualties mounted at a rate that threatened to turn the landing into a complete failure. Officers who had been carefully briefed on their objectives fell dead or wounded before they could give their first orders. Radio operators carrying the heavy backpack radios of that era were priority targets, and many were hit before they could establish communications with ships offshore. Units that were supposed to land in specific sectors were carried off course by tides and currents, depositing men in front of different strong points than they had studied in pre-invasion briefings. The careful organization dissolved into chaos as survivors from different units, many of them strangers to each other, found themselves huddled behind whatever cover existed on a beach that had been deliberately cleared of obstacles to create better fields of fire for the defenders. Small groups of men began to move forward on their own initiative, without orders, without coordination, driven by leadership from sergeants and junior officers who understood that staying put meant certain death. They used whatever cover the barren beach offered, and there wasn't much. Tank obstacles that German engineers had emplaced to stop vehicles now provided the only solid cover for infantrymen. Shell craters offered temporary refuge, though everyone knew that artillery rarely hits the same spot twice, so yesterday's crater was today's safe spot. Even the fallen, the bodies of men who had been hit in the first terrible minutes, provided a few inches of cover that might mean the difference between life and death. Training that had been drilled into these soldiers back in England now proved its worth. They had been taught to watch the German machine guns, to time the pauses when gunners had to change ammunition belts or swap out overheated barrels. Those pauses lasted only seconds, but in those brief windows of opportunity, men could sprint forward, gaining a few yards before the next burst forced them down again. Officers and sergeants screamed themselves hoarse trying to get men to move during those precious seconds, knowing that momentum was everything, that if they could just keep pushing forward eventually, they would get close enough to silence the guns. On one sector of the beach, a sergeant whose name appeared in after-action reports gathered a small team that included a bazooka operator. Their target was Strong Point WN61, one of the most deadly positions on Omaha Beach, a nest that commanded a clear view of the shoreline and had been lashing the beach with interlocking machine gun and anti-tank fire since the first boats touched down. The team used craters and the bodies of the fallen to work their way forward, moving only when the guns paused, freezing when the firing resumed. They got close enough to engage a 50mm anti-tank gun that had been supporting the machine gun positions, destroying it with a bazooka round that turned the gun and its crew into twisted metal and broken bodies. Then they crawled even closer, into ranges where they could throw grenades and use small arms fire against the firing ports. The fight at close quarters was vicious and personal. They killed 7 German defenders in a battle that lasted minutes, but must have felt like hours. 2 machine gun positions were destroyed, their crews dead at their weapons. The American team lost 1 man killed and had another wounded, but that single action, multiplied across the beach by dozens of similar small unit assaults, relieved an enormous amount of pressure on the men still pinned down near the waterline and opened a route inland for follow-on forces. Across the length of Omaha Beach, similar scenes played out throughout the morning and into the early afternoon. Rangers, those elite light infantry units that had been specifically trained for this kind of assault, stormed strong points under the cover of smoke grenades, using speed and aggression to get close enough to silence the guns with explosives and small arms fire. Engineers, who were supposed to be clearing obstacles and marking safe lanes for vehicles, found themselves in the infantry fight, using their demolitions expertise to blow open bunkers and neutralize fortified positions. Regular infantry units that had been scattered by the chaotic landing conditions reformed around whoever was willing to lead, following sergeants and lieutenants up draws and gullies that led toward the bluffs overlooking the beach. At Dog White sector, Rangers fought their way to a strong point and overwhelmed it after bitter close-quarters combat. On Easy Red, engineers managed to clear enough obstacles to carve lanes through the beach defences, allowing troops to scale the bluffs and begin outflanking the MG42 positions that had pinned them down for so long. But reaching a bunker or gun position was only half the test. The decisive moments came at arm's length, in fighting that was personal and savage in a way that most modern people cannot truly comprehend. Assault teams would work their way close enough to hurl grenades through firing ports, those narrow slits in the concrete that allowed Germans to fire out while remaining protected from incoming fire. The grenades would detonate inside, in confined spaces where the blast and shrapnel had nowhere to go except through human bodies. Then the attackers would rush the position, shooting any survivors who emerged wounded or stunned, or storming through doorways to clear the interior room by room. Flamethrowers, Those horrific weapons that sprayed burning liquid through the air were used to sear through firing embrasures, forcing defenders to choose between burning to death or abandoning their positions. The men who wielded flamethrowers were often targeted first by German gunners who knew how devastating those weapons could be in close quarters, but enough flamethrower operators survived to make a significant difference in reducing fortified nests. Once the beach had finally cracked, once enough strong points had been neutralized or bypassed, some German gunners found themselves in an impossible situation. They were wounded or running low on ammunition, or cut off from any hope of reinforcement or retreat. Some chose to surrender, emerging from their positions with hands raised, hoping that the rules of war would protect them as prisoners. But given the butcher's bill that those guns had inflicted on the Americans, given that some companies had suffered casualty rates approaching 90%, not every white flag was honoured in those chaotic first hours. There are accounts, some official and some whispered, of machine gunners being shot even after they had raised their hands. War crime is a strong term and one that historians debate carefully, but the heat of battle, the rage that comes from seeing friends and comrades torn apart, the knowledge that the man now surrendering had spent the morning systematically killing everyone he could aim at, these factors sometimes overcome the training and discipline that are supposed to prevent such acts. By early afternoon on the 6th of June, the tide had turned in the most literal sense. The ocean itself was rising with the tide, covering the obstacles and bodies that littered the beach, but metaphorically the military tide had turned as well. Pockets of American infantry and engineers had seized the high ground overlooking the beaches. They were destroying or bypassing the remaining strong points, pushing inland, beginning to link up scattered units into something resembling an organized force. After action reports compiled in the days and weeks following the invasion gave credit where it was due, one report from Omaha Beach, written in the dry language of military bureaucracy, concluded that the bluffs were taken through the undaunted courage of the infantry and engineers after the pre-landing bombardment failed. When the MG42s finally fell silent, when the last of the active gun positions had been overrun or abandoned, the change in the battle's character was immediate and dramatic. Beach exits that had been death traps for hours suddenly opened. Armoured vehicles that had been waiting offshore or stalled on the sand began pushing inland. Isolated footholds and beachheads that had been maintained by small desperate groups of men began to link up into a continuous front. The invasion, which had teetered on the edge of failure for most of the morning, rolled forward with a momentum that would not stop until Germany itself fell. The MG42 crews who survived that day would continue to fight throughout the Normandy campaign, in the nightmare terrain of the hedgerows where every field was a fortress and every lane a potential ambush site. But they would never again be so densely concentrated, never again have such perfect fields of fire, and never again have even the remotest chance of halting the Allied advance in a single day's fighting. For the Allied infantry who faced those guns during the landings, the experience was pure concentrated terror that marked them for life. Many men in the first wave had never been under fire before. Their previous combat experience consisted of training exercises with blank ammunition and instructors who shouted at them to keep their heads down. They heard the real thing long before they ever saw the beach, that distinctive tearing rip that could be distinguished from every other weapon sound on the battlefield. Veterans who had heard it in other campaigns later said the sound could freeze your blood, could make your legs stop working, could paralyze you with a fear so intense it was almost physical. When the ramp on the front of a landing craft dropped and men had to run forward into that fire, every instinct screamed at them to lie flat and stay put, to make themselves as small as possible, to find any cover and cling to it. Leaders, the sergeants and officers who understood that movement was survival, bellowed at men to move or die where they lay. The shoreline offered almost nothing in terms of shelter. Medic Ray Lambert, who survived Omaha Beach and later wrote about his experiences, recalled seeing rounds slicing through the water, hitting men who were already struggling in the surf, who were weighed down with equipment and trying desperately to reach the sand. On Dog Green sector, One company suffered casualties close to 90% within the first few minutes of the landing, a casualty rate that in any other battle in history would have caused the survivors to break and run. Yet even in the face of such losses, men continued to push forward. Some moved because they had been ordered to, and military discipline held even under unimaginable stress. Some pushed forward because duty and training took over when conscious thought became impossible. Some advanced simply because stopping meant certain death, and even a slim chance of survival was better than none. From the other side of the gun sights, from the German perspective, the view was different, but the horror was just as intense. Heinrich Severloh, 23 years old in June of 1944, manned an MG42 in Strongpoint WN62 high above Omaha Beach. He survived the war and in later years gave interviews describing what he experienced that morning. When dawn broke and he saw the invasion fleet for the first time, he later described the sight as unreal, impossible to process mentally. The sheer scale of it, the thousands of ships covering the sea, was beyond anything he had been prepared to expect. When the first landing craft came into range and the order came to open fire, he pressed the trigger and kept it pressed for what seemed like an eternity. He fed belt after belt of ammunition into the gun, nearly 12,000 rounds over roughly 9 hours of continuous combat, a volume of fire that most soldiers never experience in an entire war. His assistant gunner, the man who was supposed to help feed the weapon and change the barrels, was gone, killed or wounded early in the battle. Comrades in nearby positions fell around him as American fire became more accurate and effective. The position filled with smoke and noise and the overwhelming smell of cordite from thousands of fired rounds. It felt futile to him, even as he kept firing. No matter how many men he saw fall, more kept coming. The landing craft kept disgorging fresh troops. Bodies piled up on the sand, but the attack continued. By early afternoon, with ammunition finally exhausted, with the position collapsing around him and American infantry getting close enough to throw grenades, Severloh grabbed a rifle and ran. He scrambled through shell craters and hedgerows, moving through the chaos of a battlefield where the front line had dissolved into scattered fighting until darkness gave him some cover. The next morning, alone and knowing that organized resistance in his sector had ended, he surrendered to American troops, very carefully making sure not to advertise the fact that he had been manning a machine gun the previous day. He had seen what happened to some gunners who surrendered, and he was terrified that his role would be discovered and he would be shot in revenge for the casualties his gun had inflicted. Many German machine gunners did not get the chance to surrender or to run. Some died in their bunkers when American assault teams used explosives or flamethrowers to neutralize the position. Some who were captured alive later expressed genuine astonishment that they had been spared, given the carnage that their weapons had created on the beach below them. The psychological scars cut both ways in the aftermath of the battle. Allied veterans carried memories of that terrible buzzsaw sound for the rest of their lives, hearing it in nightmares decades later, flinching at sounds that reminded them of it. German survivors remembered faces, specific individuals they had shot at, the expressions of men who had been hit and went down. Heinrich Severloh, like many veterans on both sides, spoke very little about his Omaha Beach experience for decades after the war. The memories were too raw, too painful, too complicated. Later in life, as he aged and as the war receded into history, he began to reach out to families of American soldiers who had been killed there, trying in some small way to build connections across the gulf of former enmity. He even met David Silver, an American veteran he had wounded during the battle. Two former enemies who had been trying to kill each other on that terrible day sat down together in their old age, something that would have been unimaginable in 1944, and found a sliver of peace and mutual understanding. The mental strain on machine gun crews during the battle was crushing in ways that are difficult for people who have never experienced combat to fully understand. They could hear footsteps and voices as American troops got closer to their positions. They knew they were specifically targeted. that every soldier who made it across the beach wanted nothing more than to kill them. They understood that their weapon, which had made them so effective and so feared, also made them marked men. The uncertainty about what would happen if they surrendered added another layer of stress to an already nightmarish situation. Were the rules of war still operating in the heat of this battle? Would surrender be accepted, or would raised hands just make them easier targets? Some chose to fight on to the death, convinced that surrender would not save them, preferring to die with a weapon in their hands. Others gave up as soon as hope vanished, gambling that the Americans would show mercy. It was a terrible choice to have to make in the middle of battle. Many German veterans who survived the war went on to lead quiet civilian lives, discussing their MG42 experience only with other veterans who could understand, who had shared similar experiences. For them, the weapon represented a complicated mixture of emotions. On one hand, it was a point of professional pride. They had been entrusted with the most important defensive weapon in the German arsenal. They had been trained to a high standard of proficiency. They had done their duty as soldiers under impossible circumstances. But on the other hand, that same weapon was a private burden. They knew what it had done. They remembered the faces. They carried guilt that had nothing to do with politics or causes, and everything to do with the simple human reality of having killed other human beings who were also just doing their duty. In the decades that followed, the MG42 secured a permanent place in the cultural memory of the Second World War. Memoirs written by soldiers from both sides mentioned it constantly. When a writer casually notes that a machine gun opened up during a particular action, readers who know the history understand that this almost certainly means an MG42. Films that attempted to portray the Normandy landings with any degree of authenticity featured that distinctive sound. The Longest Day, released in the early 1960s, introduced a generation of moviegoers to the weapon's reputation. Saving Private Ryan, released decades later with far more graphic depictions of violence, made sure to include the buzzsaw audio and the terror it inspired. While the concrete bunkers and gun positions along the Normandy coastline still stand today, they serve as silent monuments to the weapon's power and to the scars it carved on both sides of the conflict. The textbook diagrams and training manuals that soldiers studied before the invasion could not capture the reality of what it meant to close with an MG42 position under fire. It meant crawling forward on your belly, pushing yourself through sand and blood and seawater, advancing metre by terrible metre while bullets cracked overhead or thudded into the ground inches away. It meant betting your life on the assumption that the gunner had not seen you yet, that you could get close enough to throw a grenade or fire a rifle grenade before he adjusted his aim. More than a few attackers fell dead just steps from their objective, so close to success that their bodies were later found right outside bunker entrances. Inside those bunkers, the fights were short and savage and final. The thick concrete walls that had protected the crews from naval bombardment now trapped them when attackers got close. Those same narrow firing ports that had been such an advantage when firing outward became fatal constrictions when someone was outside throwing grenades in. For the MG42 crews, those final moments were the ones they had dreaded most. Hold out and be overrun by men who had seen their friends killed and might not be in a mood to take prisoners, or attempt to surrender and hope that mercy would be shown. Neither option was comforting. The machine gun teams understood intellectually that they were priority targets. They had been trained to understand their tactical importance. But that knowledge came with the fear of reprisals, the worry that men who had just watched half their unit get cut down might not be inclined to follow the rules of war when they finally got their hands on the gunners responsible. Most Allied troops did abide by the Geneva Convention and took prisoners according to the rules, even in the heat of combat. The vast majority of German soldiers who surrendered were treated properly, disarmed, and sent back to prisoner of war compounds. But there are accounts, some in official records and some in private letters and memoirs, of machine gunners being shot on the spot by men who had lost friends to those same guns just minutes earlier. Professional military detachment, The ability to separate the person from their role and to treat enemies as soldiers rather than as personal targets can be very difficult to summon in the seconds immediately following a massacre. That uncertainty, the knowledge that surrender might not guarantee survival, hung over every decision that German crews made in those last desperate moments of a fight. The German defenders were not all committed ideologues fighting for the regime. Some were, certainly. There were true believers scattered throughout the ranks, men who accepted the propaganda and convinced themselves they were defending civilization. But many others were simply soldiers doing what soldiers do, following orders because that is what military discipline requires. Some were conscripts from occupied territories in Eastern Europe, men who were fighting more out of fear of what would happen to them if they refused than out of any loyalty to Berlin. A few surrendered almost immediately once the position became untenable, seeing no point in dying for a cause they had never believed in. Others fought on until ammunition ran out or the position was physically overrun, not because they expected to change the outcome, but because they could not bring themselves to give up while they still had rounds to fire. The invasion of Normandy represented a turning point that extended far beyond the tactical details of any individual battle. For the machine gun crews who survived, whether they spent the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps or continued fighting in the retreat across France and into Germany itself, the 6th of June marked the moment when they understood that the war was lost. The sheer scale of Allied material superiority, the endless waves of men and machines that kept coming no matter how many were destroyed, made it clear that Germany could not win through defensive fighting. They could make the Allies pay a heavy price for every metre of ground, and they did exactly that for the next 11 months, but ultimate defeat was now inevitable. Individual stories from that day illustrate the human dimension in ways that statistics and casualty figures cannot. There was Franz Gockel, another MG42 gunner who spent hours firing at the American landing forces. He survived the initial assault and the close quarters fighting that followed. Years later, he described the psychological impact of seeing men fall to his fire, of watching waves of infantry keep coming despite the losses. He spoke about the moment his ammunition ran out, the sudden silence after hours of continuous noise, the realization that he was now defenseless. He surrendered and spent the next several years in a prisoner-of-war camp, working on American farms, treated reasonably well by his captors despite everything that had happened. He eventually returned to Germany, started a family, worked a normal job, and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with war. But he never forgot those hours behind the gun, and in his old age he reached out to veterans' organizations, not to glorify what had happened, but to try to make sense of it, to connect with others who understood. There was Heinz Sevelow, mentioned earlier, whose story became one of the most detailed personal accounts we have from the German side. His post-war life followed a similar pattern. Silence for decades, then a gradual opening up as he aged and felt compelled to tell his story. He worked with historians, provided detailed information about the battle from his perspective, helped researchers understand German tactics and thinking. He attended memorial ceremonies and met with American veterans. Some of those meetings were awkward and painful. How do you shake hands with someone whose friends you killed? How do you look into the eyes of a man you shot at, who carries scars from that day? But other meetings found common ground. Both sides had been soldiers doing their duty in a war they did not start. Both sides had been terrified. Both sides had lost friends. In their shared trauma, they found a basis for something approaching reconciliation. The broader impact of the MG42 extended well beyond Normandy. German crews continued to use the weapon throughout the fighting in France, in the Battle of the Bulge, in the final desperate defence of German territory as Allied armies closed in from both east and west. The weapon itself was so effective that after the war multiple armies continued to use it in modified form. The MG3, a slightly updated version, served in numerous military forces for decades after 1945. The basic design was copied and adapted by other nations. The concept of the general-purpose machine gun, a single weapon that could serve both as a light machine gun fired from a bipod and as a heavy machine gun fired from a tripod machine gun on a tripod mount, became standard in armies around the world. In that sense, the MG42 won its own small victory even as the regime that produced it collapsed. The beaches of Normandy today are peaceful places, popular with tourists who come to see the sites where history was made. The bunkers remain, their concrete now weathered and covered with graffiti and commemorative plaques. You can stand in the positions where machine gunners sat and look out at the same view they saw on the morning of June 6th. The beach looks different now, peaceful and empty most of the time, but if you know the history, you can almost hear the echoes. Tour guides point out firing angles and explain the tactical situation. Museums display weapons and equipment, including MG42s that were recovered from the battlefield. Elderly veterans, their numbers shrinking every year, sometimes return to the places where they fought. They walk the sand, visit the cemeteries where their friends are buried, stand silently with memories that no one else can fully share. The human cost of the landings was staggering by any measure. On Omaha Beach alone, American casualties for the first day totaled around 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Some units effectively ceased to exist as organized fighting forces, their casualties so severe that survivors had to be completely reorganized and reinforced before they could function. The Bedford Boys, a National Guard company from Bedford, Virginia, landed in the first wave at Omaha and suffered devastating losses. The small town of Bedford lost more men per capita than any other community in America, a tragedy that is commemorated today in memorials and museums. German casualties are harder to calculate precisely because record-keeping broke down in the chaos of the battle, but defensive positions all along the coast suffered severe losses as the multi-beach invasion overwhelmed prepared defenses through sheer weight of numbers. For the machine gun crews specifically, those who survived the initial combat faced various fates depending on when and where they were captured or killed. Some died in their bunkers and were not recovered for days or weeks, their bodies found by grave registration units that followed behind the advancing front lines. Some were captured on the beach itself, disarmed and sent to the rear, eventually ending up in prisoner of war camps in Britain or North America. Some escaped the immediate battle and retreated with whatever organized units they could find, continuing to fight in subsequent engagements until they were killed or captured later in the campaign. A few, a very few, survived the entire war and made it home to Germany to face the ruins of their country and the challenge of building new lives in the aftermath of total defeat. The psychological impact on survivors from both sides created a shared community of trauma that transcended national boundaries. American veterans who had faced the MG42 fire understood in a visceral way what combat stress meant. They dealt with what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though in that era it was not formally recognized or treated in the way we understand today. They had nightmares. They struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many friends died. They had difficulty adjusting to civilian life and normal peacetime concerns that seemed trivial compared to what they had experienced. German veterans dealt with an additional burden. They had not only the trauma of combat, but also the moral weight of having fought for a regime that was revealed to have committed unprecedented atrocities. How do you process the experience of having done your duty as a soldier when the cause you served turned out to be monstrous? Many dealt with this by compartmentalizing, by insisting that they had been regular soldiers fighting a regular war, that they had no knowledge of or involvement in the crimes that others committed. This was true for some and rationalization for others, and the line between the two was often blurry. The equipment itself tells part of the story. MG42s that were captured or recovered from the battlefield became prized souvenirs for some Allied troops, though most soldiers had no interest in lugging heavy machine guns around as they advanced through France. Some weapons ended up in military museums. Others were studied by Allied weapons designers who wanted to understand what made the German machine gun so effective. The high rate of fire, achieved through a sophisticated recoil mechanism, became a feature that weapons designers tried to replicate. The quick change barrel system, which allowed a trained crew to swap barrels in seconds, became standard in subsequent machine gun designs. The general concept of a belt-fed weapon that could serve multiple roles became the template for modern infantry support weapons. One aspect of the battle that often gets overlooked in dramatic retellings is the mundane reality of what machine gun crews actually did during quiet moments between attacks. They cleaned weapons, loaded ammunition belts, ate cold rations, tried to rest while remaining alert for the next assault. They dealt with fear in different ways. Some prayed. Some wrote letters home that would never be sent. Some made dark jokes that only other soldiers would understand. Some sat in silence, too frightened or exhausted to speak. When the order finally came to open fire, when landing craft appeared offshore and the battle began, all of that waiting and worrying crystallized into action. Muscle memory and training took over. The gunner traversed the weapon, adjusted his aim, pressed the trigger. The assistant fed belts and watched for barrel overheating. The ammunition bearer ran back and forth with heavy cans of linked rounds. It became almost mechanical, a routine that was rehearsed countless times in training and now executed under live fire with real consequences. The actual experience of being under machine gun fire is something that resists easy description. Survivors struggled to put it into words that civilians could understand. The sound was unlike anything in normal life, not just loud, but with a quality that communicated immediate danger on an instinctive level. The bullets themselves were usually invisible, travelling faster than sound, arriving before you heard the gunfire. What you saw were impacts, sand and water erupting, wood and metal splintering, bodies jerking and falling. What you heard was the crack of supersonic rounds passing close, the buzz of near misses, the wet thump of bullets hitting flesh. What you felt was absolute helplessness, the knowledge that you were completely exposed to something that could kill you, and there was nothing you could do except hope the gunner aimed somewhere else. The crews themselves experienced a different kind of stress. They were protected by concrete and earth, but knew they were trapped in place. Mobility was survival for infantry, but machine gunners gave up mobility for firepower and protection. Once the battle started, they could not leave their position without abandoning their weapon and their duty. They had to sit there and endure whatever came at them: naval shells, mortar rounds, tank fire, rifle grenades, and eventually infantry assault teams with demolition charges. The noise inside a bunker during bombardment was indescribable. Concrete dust filling the air, the concussion from near misses making ears bleed and senses reel. Some men broke under that stress, curling up in corners and refusing to man their weapons. Others found reserves of courage they did not know they possessed and kept fighting through terror that should have paralyzed them. After the battle, after the guns fell silent and the beach was secured, burial details faced the grim task of dealing with the dead. Bodies were everywhere, American and German, some intact and some not. The salt water and summer heat accelerated decomposition. Grave registration teams worked to identify the dead, recover dog tags, record locations. American dead were eventually buried in military cemeteries that were established near the beaches. German dead were also buried, though with less ceremony, often in mass graves that were later reorganized into formal cemeteries after the war. The recovery work continued for weeks as bodies washed up with the tide or were found in bunkers and defensive positions. It was necessary work, but it left its own psychological scars on the men who had to do it. The question of war crimes and battlefield justice remains complicated and controversial. International law was clear. Soldiers who surrender are entitled to protection as prisoners of war. Killing surrendering troops is a war crime. But the law also recognizes that combat is chaotic and that split-second decisions made under fire cannot always be judged by peacetime standards. There were undoubtedly cases on June 6th where German soldiers who were attempting to surrender were shot, either because their surrender was not recognized in the chaos or because the men shooting them were too angry or traumatized to stop. There were probably also cases where Germans who claimed to be surrendering were actually trying to buy time or create opportunities to resume fighting. The fog of war obscures these details and makes definitive judgments difficult. What is clear is that the vast majority of German prisoners taken on D-Day were treated according to the laws of war once they were in custody, fed, given medical treatment, and eventually shipped to permanent POW camps. One particularly haunting aspect of the whole experience was the aftermath for the families back home. American families received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands had been killed or wounded or were missing. The telegrams were brief and offered few details. Families had to wait weeks or months to learn anything more specific. German families, in the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich, often learned nothing definitive for years. Men were listed as missing, their fate unknown. Families hoped they were prisoners and would eventually return. Some did, many did not. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, the not knowing whether to mourn or to hope. The MG42 gunners, who survived and became prisoners of war, spent the remainder of the conflict in camps that varied widely in quality and conditions. American and British camps generally followed Geneva Convention standards, providing adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Prisoners worked on farms or in other non-military industries, receiving small pay for their labor. Some established friendly relationships with guards and local civilians. Others remained hostile and uncooperative throughout their captivity. Many German POWs held in North America were shocked by the prosperity and abundance they saw, so different from the deprivation and destruction in Europe. Some came to question everything they had been told about the enemy and about the war. Others clung to their beliefs and remained convinced that Germany had been right and the world had been wrong. Repatriation after the war brought its own challenges. Prisoners held in America or Britain were among the last to be released, sometimes not returning to Germany until late 1947 or even 1948. When they finally came home, they found a country that was physically destroyed and psychologically shattered. Cities were rubble. The economy had collapsed. Millions of people were displaced or missing. The full scope of the atrocities committed by the regime was coming to light through war crimes, trials, and journalism. Veterans returning from captivity had to navigate this landscape while also dealing with their own trauma and trying to resume civilian lives that had been interrupted years earlier. Many succeeded, finding work, raising families, contributing to the reconstruction. Some struggled with what would later be understood as PTSD, turning to alcohol or withdrawing from society. A few could never adjust and ended their own lives. Looking back from the perspective of today, the 8th decade after the invasion, we can see the Battle of Normandy as a decisive turning point in the war and in the 20th century. The successful establishment of a second front in Western Europe doomed Germany to a two-front war it could not win. The industrial and manpower resources of America, Britain, Canada, and the Free French, combined with the Soviet forces grinding forward from the east, made German defeat inevitable. But beyond the grand strategic picture, the human stories remain compelling. The young men who climbed out of landing craft into machine gun fire showed courage that is difficult to comprehend. The young men who operated those machine guns, whether they believed in their cause or were just following orders, faced their own terrors and made their own impossible choices. The MG42 itself, that mechanical device made of steel and wood and springs, was just a tool. It had no morality, no will, no consciousness. It did what it was designed to do with terrible efficiency. The men who used it, on both sides of the conflict, were moral agents making choices under circumstances that most people will never face. Some made choices that history judges as honourable. Some made choices that were crimes. Most made choices that fell somewhere in between, in grey areas where judgment is difficult and certainty is elusive. What we can say with confidence is that the experience marked everyone who went through it, that the scars were real and lasting, and that the memory of what happened on those beaches should make us think carefully about war and its costs. The lessons learned from Normandy influenced military doctrine for generations. Amphibious assault techniques were refined based on what worked and what failed. The importance of specialized armor support was confirmed. The need for accurate naval gunfire support was recognized. The value of small unit leadership and initiative was reaffirmed, but perhaps the most important lesson was the reminder that even the best plans can fail and that battles are ultimately won by individual soldiers making split-second decisions under fire. All the planning and logistics and strategic thinking in the world cannot substitute for the courage of the men who actually have to cross the beach and silence the guns. In remembering these events, we honor not just one side or the other, but the shared human experience of combat. The American soldier who advanced across Omaha Beach under fire was showing remarkable courage. The German soldier who stayed at his gun despite overwhelming odds was also showing a form of courage, even if in service of an unjust cause. Both men were terrified. Both men saw friends die. Both men did things they would remember for the rest of their lives. That shared experience creates a bond that transcends nationality and politics, a recognition that combat is fundamentally a human experience that strips away everything except the most basic questions of survival and duty and fear and death. That is what happened to the MG42 crews who gave up after cutting down waves of Allied troops. Some died, some were captured, some escaped. All were changed forever by those hours when they stood at the center of the largest invasion in history and did what soldiers do, their duty as they understood it, under circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance.